Visual Studio is a tool that I use almost every day. I have strong opinions about the best way to configure Visual Studio for the way that I work. The Settings option dialog is the place to tweak the IDE so that it works the way that you want. I'm inside Visual Studio, but I do not have a solution or project open because I'm not writing any code. Before I make any changes to my settings, let's talk about how you export your settings so you can save your current set. To do that, you go to the Tools menu. This is the item I'm looking for, Import and Export Settings. There are 3 buttons to choose from. This first one allows me to export my selected environmental settings. If I click on Next, you'll see that I get a choice of all the settings that I want to save. By default, everything is checked in here, but I can turn off certain sections if I don't want to save those. I'm going to use all settings and then click on Next. In this portion of the wizard, I specify the name of my file. By default, it uses today's date and the extension VS Settings, and the location where I want to store those files. I'll click on Finish, and I have successfully exported my files. To import those settings at a later date, I go to Tools, Import and Export Settings. This time, of course, I choose Import Selected Environment Settings. Now here I'm going to select No, just import my new settings. And then I click on Next. And then here I can go out and browse on my hard drive to find my saved settings files. Did you notice something on the previous screen? Let's go back and look. Here's the default settings. This is the screen that you see when you first start Visual Studio for the very first time. This configures it so that you're using, let's say, the JavaScript keystrokes in the JavaScript menus. If you ever want to reconfigure your Visual Studio to use a different set of settings, just come in here and choose from this list. For my example, I set my computer to General Development Settings. I'm going to cancel out of this dialog because I really don't want to import any settings. Now let's look at the Tools options. There are hundreds of settings in here, literally. There's settings for environment and projects and solutions and many more. We're going to look at the ones in the debugging section later in the course. We'll also look at the ones in the text editor and a couple other nodes in here. For today, I want to look at just a few settings that I use as general settings inside Visual Studio. I'll start by going to Environment and looking at General. It's here that you can pick your color theme. Now, I've installed an add-in. Remember in the first chapter, I added some extra tools to Visual Studio to enable color theming and to remove the all caps menu. That's why I have more choices here than you might have on your computer. I would encourage you, if you have a good GPU card in your computer, to turn on this checkbox, use hardware graphics acceleration. That means that you'll get a faster rendering of the pixels inside Visual Studio if that checkbox is checked. You probably want to have this enabled, auto recover. Save auto recover information every 5 minutes. That way, if Visual Studio crashes, you can recover your files. Let's look at the keyboard shortcuts. Here they are. In this section of the option dialog, I can pick the keystrokes that are assigned to each command inside Visual Studio. For instance, I want to remap the keystroke that's applied to full screen. Here it is, view.fullscreen. Currently, that's tied to Shift plus Alt plus Enter. For some reason, that keystroke is hard for me to remember, so I'm going to map that to the F2 key. So what I do is I move down here and click in this text box. Then I go to my keyboard and I press the F2 key. Down at the bottom, it tells me that this shortcut is currently in use by the view.edit label. I'm going to override that by clicking on the Assign button and then click OK. Now when I return back to Visual Studio and I press F2, it puts me in full screen mode. And when I press F2 a second time, it puts me back in menued view. One more setting I want to look at. We'll go back to Tools and then Options. And then I'm going to go to Projects and Solutions and look in the General mode. It's in this section that you define your default location for your projects and the place where it loads your templates and other items. This is also where you specify whether it shows an error list when a build has errors. You can also choose to track your active item in Solution Explorer. That means as you click on your tabs inside Visual Studio, it will go over to your Solution Explorer and find that item in Solution Explorer and select it. I always like to have the Always Show Solution turned on. That means that no matter how many projects I have inside Solution Explorer, it's always going to make sure there's a top node that contains the solution information. Then the last thing I like to do is turn off this Save New Projects when created. Let me show you what that does. I'll unselect this and then choose OK. Now I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to make this a Windows app, a WPF app. Click on OK. Go to my toolbox. Add this button. Now I worked in this project for 15 minutes and I decide that it's really not doing what I want and I don't want to keep it on my hard drive. By changing that setting to say don't save the project when it's first created, I can now choose to close the solution. And Visual Studio says, would you like to save your project or discard it? So what Visual Studio is doing is saving this file in a temporary location. And it's not until I click the Save button that it gets stored in a permanent location. So I'm going to click on Discard, and it's gone. This is a perfect solution for trying out little samples without cluttering your project list with a bunch of fake project names. As I mentioned, the configuration settings in the dialog are endless. You are bound to find a few that enhance the way that you work with inside Visual Studio. I'll show more settings in other movies in this course. Remember to use export settings once you have Visual Studio configured the way that you want. That way, you won't have to spend a lot of time reconfiguring your environment if your hard drive crashes or you get a new computer.